Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about some issues about being Muslim and living in the West, which is something that many of us do on a day-to-day basis. So I have a couple of pointers to talk about, and then we will do a few questions in case anyone has anything in particular they wanted to talk about. I know erasing alcohol from American and Western cultures, and I don't think that we as Muslims need to try to do that. It's very easy to not drink. There's this pervasive sort of attitude or belief that in order to have fun, you have to be drinking. There's a particular TV personality who I won't mention by name, who travels around to different countries, and every time he goes to a Muslim country, he always ends up saying something like, "So what do people do for fun? How do people have fun here?" And it's not that difficult to have fun without drinking. I don't know if, especially ladies, if you've ever been to one of those like all women like wedding parties or engagement parties, those are always very fun, and there's no alcohol there. So on that, to sum up, I did get a question about how, like, feeling isolated from your colleagues at work, because a lot of socializing or going out to lunch takes place in the UK in pubs, or in the US in bars, or whatever the main thing is. Some Muslims will say that even going into a pub or a bar at all is haram. Others will say you can go in as long as you're not ordering alcohol. You need to figure out what makes most sense to you, and obviously don't just take the easiest route as far as that goes and be like, oh well, I'm just going to decide that I think drinking or going to a pub is okay as long as I'm not drinking. If you really, really do believe that, and you feel that you have a good foundation for that belief, then do what you feel is most comfortable. In general, though, I think it would probably be, for lack of a better term, safer to not go. But I do understand how that would leave you feeling isolated. I'm actually a really bad person to ask about this sort of thing because I don't socialize. I'm a huge shut-in. So when I'm like, oh, someone wants me to go out drinking with them, no. It's just easy for me. But I know that's not how everyone is. So if you're a really social person, maybe, you suggest a place to go to lunch, or you can host something at your house. There are lots of ways to be social, but I do understand how in everyday, day-to-day kind of situations that might feel isolating. I wish I had a better answer for that, but I unfortunately don't. The only thing is, we just can't expect people to do things the Islamic way, and we have to. Being a Muslim and existing as a Muslim in the West, especially these days, is an active choice that we have to make every single day, especially those of us who are visibly Muslim. It's something that we have to do. It's not just a state of being, it's an activity. So I do understand how the isolation can set in, but all I can say is, inshallah, try and make the best choices for you and not get distracted by these petty things in the dunya when, in reality, this is all just temporary, and if you don't drink, you're gonna be fine. I'm sorry, I wish I had something better to say about this in particular, but like I said, I'm a shut-in, so this is not an issue for me. But I'm going to move on now to everyone's very favorite topic to discuss ever, which is marriage. Everyone just loves marriage. So I'm going to get started. Some people have said that it is difficult to get married. It's difficult to find a good Muslim spouse. I think there are lots of good people out there. I think there are lots of good Muslims. I don't necessarily think that it is across the board true. I think a lot of times, and this is not all the time, because there are a lot of different social issues that come into this, but oftentimes we end up making it harder for ourselves. And I don't mean like by making it, by being too picky, although that has a reputation of being a factor. Certain families have a reputation for, requiring 3 PhDs, and he's a doctor and an engineer and a lawyer, etc., etc. But that's not what I mean. I think something that makes marriage difficult, or finding a spouse difficult, is that we expect too much too soon. And on one hand, Islamically, we are encouraged to get married young. But on the other hand, I think people just sort of take that at face value and don't look deeper into it. People like to just say, you should get married young to avoid sin. And that in and of itself is a little bit on the dangerous side. Simply because, as with everything in religion and especially in Islam, there's something deeper to it. There's something more to it. So if the only reason you are getting married is to avoid sin, in my opinion, that is incorrect. You can't just get married young and call it a day and say, like, okay, I've done it the Islamic way. If we are supposed to be encouraging our children and ourselves to be married at a young age, we need to be preparing our children and preparing ourselves for getting married at a young age. And by young age, I should be clear, I mean someone who is of the age and ability to consent. So I'm not talking like very, very young, obviously. So we can't just throw people out there and say, okay, you're young, get married quick. It's what's encouraged. No, you need to, be making the effort to make sure that yourself and your children are prepared. And that means it's hard work. And it's, again, it's making an active choice every day to make certain behaviors, to perform certain behaviors, and to encourage a certain kind of maturity. And it can't just be about the surface things. It can't just be about avoiding sin. It has to be so much deeper than that. That may be part of it, but that can't be the whole picture. Getting into some more specifics here, I received a question here that says, I want to marry a Muslim girl, but I'm still in college. What would you advise us to do if we know our parents don't agree, even though we can each take a part-time job and cover our own expenses until we graduate? Again, this goes right back to what I was just mentioning. If this is a very much an individual thing. Some people will be ready to be married in college, and some people are not anywhere near the emotional maturity. You have to remember that, like I said, avoiding sin cannot be the only reason to get married. There's so much more to marriage than avoiding sin. Marriage is a lifelong commitment. It's not something that can be taken lightly. If you're in that situation, I think that you really need to take a step back from the emotion of it. Take a step back from your feelings and really look at the basis of the relationship. Why do you want to marry this person? For logical reasons. And I am a very emotional person, so I understand how, emotions can play a strong part in it. I completely get that. But when you're looking at something that is so lifelong and so much of a commitment, you really need to take a logical viewpoint, first of all. So what are the logical reasons that you have? Are you compatible with this person? Do they follow Islam in a similar manner to you? Do you agree on one thing that was mentioned recently in an About Islam article was one woman posted a question saying that she doesn't think she wants children. If you don't want children, you need to make sure that your spouse is aware of that. That's not something that you can go into marriage just being like, oh, I'm sure it will be fine. No, you need to really take care of these things. And if you go through all these issues and you match up with this person and you feel that you're emotionally mature, then I would say, in my opinion, that seems to be a situation where you would be emotionally ready for such a commitment. I hesitate to make this an Islam versus Western culture kind of thing, because I typically hate that dichotomy. There's nothing about Islam that means we cannot exist in Western culture, but I do feel that there is too much emphasis placed on, this is going to sound horrible, but just bear with me for a second, there is too much emphasis placed on love. Now, love is a very important component in marriage for certain individuals, such as myself. But that is not the most important ingredient to making sure your marriage works. You need to make sure that you are on the same page, and you have to make sure that there is a foundation of trust and respect. And if you have those, then the love will come. Sooner or later, doesn't really matter, but it will come. So if you have all those things, I don't know the full situation, of course, so I can't say if your parents really have an Islamic reason to forbid you to get married. If they don't, then, Islamically they can't. They cannot forbid you if there's no Islamic reason to forbid you. If there is some sort of Islamic reason that simply isn't listed in this question, then that's a different topic. Another question about marriage, everyone's favorite. About expensive and complicated weddings. And it says, my best friend just got married to a Muslim of Asian background, and his family spent a fortune on the wedding. Why is it so complicated, and why do they like to show off? If my family can't afford all the wedding-related expenses, does it mean I will never get married? No, it does not. It does not mean that. I do not like to talk about my personal life, but just very brief surface. I got married to someone from a different culture, and we had an extremely simple wedding. We went to a mosque. We had our witnesses there. We got married, and a few days later, we got legally married, and it was very small, just with family. There were as many people as I can count on just over one hand. I mean, it was extremely small. You do not have to have a big wedding. I can't answer the question, why do they like to show off? I don't know. I don't want to say it's un-Islamic, because if people want to enjoy their wedding, I don't see a reason why they can't. But I do not think that there should not be any pressure to do that sort of thing. That if that's the thing that's keeping you from getting married, there's something wrong there. The important thing to remember is that marriage is marriage. You can't just think about a wedding. Marriage can't lead up to a wedding. You have your entire life. You need to think about that, or people need to think about that. I see a comment here. to live a married life, you don't need to expect perfection from your spouse. That is true. No one's perfect, of course. I have many imperfections. But you do need a baseline, and there are certain things that should not be compromised. Perfection, of course, should never be expected, but if there is a lack of trust or a lack of respect, then you have something in the foundation that's broken. You should know what your bare minimum, or not your, I don't want to make it sound like you should settle for a bare minimum, but you should know what your line is. And if it crosses this line, then it's not okay. And don't compromise on that. You know, in order to have a happy marriage, you need to make sure that you are going to be content with what you have and what others have. Or, I'm sorry, not what others, what you have and what your spouse has. You both need to be content with it. Okay, there's another question to sort of get away from marriage, and if there are more marriage questions, don't worry. We can come back to it. There's a question, someone says that they're very depressed and not following the path thoroughly, and how to increase spirituality. First and foremost, I want this individual to know that they are not alone. I have been through many times in my life, and I know people who are going through times in their life where they're experiencing this as well. And it can feel very isolating because you see other Muslims around you and you presume that they are doing fine because they look fine, but they might be looking at you and seeing the same thing. So first and foremost, you're not the only one. I know for me, after I had my children, it's usually the time where I suffered the most in my religion. Sometimes it took me years to feel spiritual again. The bad news is that there's no one answer for how to increase spirituality. I think there are different things that work for different people. For me, I love to read the Quran because the Quran itself is what brought me to Islam. So reading that, reflecting on it, and thinking like, there's no way that this came from anyone but God. Even in English, if you have a good translation. I mean, obviously, the Quran is in Arabic, but even with a good translation, you can still make that connection. I don't speak Arabic functionally at all, so for other people it might be going to the mosque. For other people it might be really trying to focus on prayers, or make sincere dua, or make dhikr, or fasting. I think that the most important thing to start with, at least for me, is to make dua to, like, because sometimes you get to this place where you don't want to be steadfast, but you want to. At least that's how it happened for me. So make dua for that desire to want to be practicing in your religion, or wanting to feel spiritual, or wanting to feel close to Allah, and inshallah that Allah will lead you to find the best thing for you. And we're posting some links to help with suggestions on how to maintain spirituality throughout the year as well. There was another comment. Someone mentioned something about culture, and I wanted to make a quick comment on that as well. This is a very, very common, not to sound, I don't know, discouraging or like I'm talking down, but this is a very common platitude that there is no culture, Islam is our culture. While I appreciate and understand that sentiment, especially when we're talking about the negative aspects of certain cultural practices, such as, I presume this was in regards to cultural pressure about having big, elaborate weddings, I do appreciate that sentiment in those parts, but in those issues, but it is also important to remember that we do have culture. And at least for me, my culture is very important to me, and I'm American. I'm from Michigan. You know, I've lived here all my life, and I love Vernors, and if you're not in Michigan, you don't know what that is. And there's a lot of, you know, I love going up north in the winter. There's a lot of stuff that is important to me about my culture. I think the important thing to note about culture is that as long as it doesn't clash with your religion, it's okay. It's encourageable even. There are certain aspects of religion that encourage cultural practice as long as they aren't against Islam. So when we're talking about things like toxic cultural pressure, such as the pressure to have a big elaborate wedding even if you can't afford it, the pressure to get married young for no other reason than, oh my gosh, you're 22, you're so old. You know, that in those aspects, it's important to say, no, you know, forget that toxic aspect of the culture. And then when we're talking about Western culture, again, going back to the alcohol, you know, obviously that's not a part of our culture that we're going to indulge in. That's just simply not, you know, we have to leave some things. And even whether your culture is Western or whether your culture is, you know, a Muslim majority, there are going to be toxic parts of the culture that you're going to want to let go. But again, when we're talking about cultural practices, there is no harm in it. I mean, as long as there is no harm in it, then we shouldn't shun it. I think one of the beautiful things about Islam is its far-reaching diversity, you know, all over the world, from East Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa to Northern Canada to Mexico. There are, you know, it's far-reaching, and I think each of those places has its own unique and beautiful way of appreciating Islam and showing their love for Islam. And I think that that's something to be celebrated and loved. But again, you know, leaving the toxic parts of culture out, or leaving the un-Islamic parts of culture out. Let's see. And then I guess this is going to circle back to one more question I had. And I honestly, again, I'm not really well equipped to answer this question. About Valentine's Day. Someone is asking, there's a lot of peer pressure at school to celebrate Valentine's Day in about 10 days. What do you recommend Muslim teenagers should do on that day? I'm not a Valentine's Day person. I'm not a social person. All I can say is that, and again, this might just be a me thing, but I never felt, even when I was a teenager and I wasn't Muslim, I never felt a lot of pressure to participate in Valentine's Day. But I know my experience isn't everyone's experience, so I can't just say, well, I didn't feel the pressure, so you shouldn't either. That would be very self-centered of me. If the pressure is really so great and you feel that you might do something that's haram, and to which degree participating in Valentine's Day is haram is, again, something that's up to interpretation. But if you feel that you might do something that you believe is haram, then, I don't know, maybe trying to stay home that day. I'm sorry, I don't have great advice on this, but that's all I've got there. And then I've got one more question, because I'm almost out of time here, but I'll go ahead, and this circles back to marriage and culture again, that's everyone's favorite. It says, how about the culture of arranged marriages where husband and wife only see each other first night of wedding? And to that I say, if everyone participating is happy with that arrangement, then that's fine, in my opinion. It's not sunnah, but and again, I think you need to really examine and make sure that no one is being pressured and no one is being coerced, and as long as everyone fully and enthusiastically consents to the arrangement, then I don't know why there would be any harm in it. I think it is better and it is sunnah to try and to know your spouse before committing to that. But if you are comfortable with the arrangement of not meeting your spouse at all until the day you're married, I do not think that is un-Islamic. If it is, then it's just something I've never heard of before. However, it is un-Islamic to make someone get married against their will. That is haram. And if that's what's happening in those situations, then that shouldn't. That is, again, one of those toxic cultural practices that would probably be better to just abandon it. And with that, I think I've answered all of the questions that I have. Let me just double check here, take a quick scroll. All right, yeah, I think I've covered it. If there are any other questions, I usually stalk the comments later on. And also I know the editors and the administrators of the page look at the comments and they gather questions to send to the writers or to save for next live session. So if you do have any more questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. And inshallah, everyone has a wonderful day. Assalamu alaikum.